In December 1900, a relief vessel approached the Flannan Isles through the cold Atlantic west of Scotland, expecting to find routine life continuing inside the lighthouse on Eilean Mòr. Instead, the station stood silent above the cliffs, its lamp dark against the winter sea, while 3 experienced keepers had vanished without witness, struggle or trace. Inside the isolated quarters, investigators discovered interrupted routines, unsettling journal entries, and small details that seemed ordinary at first glance yet grew increasingly disturbing the longer they were examined. As you move deeper into the story, the lonely geography of the Hebrides, the violent weather surrounding the island, and the strange evidence left behind inside the station begin to form a mystery that never settles into certainty. You follow the delayed arrival of the Hesperus, the fearful tone recorded in the Lighthouse journal, the warnings once attached to Eilean Mòr itself, and the competing explanations that continued haunting the case long after the Atlantic closed over the cliffs below. The arrival at Eilean Mòr, beyond the western edge of Scotland's Outer Hebrides, where the Atlantic Ocean widens into an immense grey expanse broken only by cliffs and violent surf. A small chain of rocky islands rises from the sea with almost no sign of human presence. The Flannan Isles, known in Scottish Gaelic as the Seven Hunters, sit exposed to some of the harshest weather in northern Europe, surrounded by waters that generations of sailors considered unpredictable even in calm seasons. Long before a lighthouse was built there, fishermen from the Isle of Lewis approached the islands with caution, and local traditions described Eilean Mòr, the largest of the group, as a place tied to old religious customs, strange silences, and an atmosphere that unsettled even experienced seafarers. It was a landscape shaped by isolation so complete that, during heavy weather, the islands could disappear entirely behind walls of rain and sea spray, leaving only the sound of waves crashing against black volcanic rock somewhere inside the fog. For centuries, the Flannan Isles remained almost untouched, except for occasional shepherds who brought sheep there during parts of the year, yet even those temporary visitors rarely stayed overnight. The islands contained the ruined remains of a small stone chapel dedicated to St. Flannan, an Irish bishop believed to have lived during the 7th century, and local accounts claim that sailors passing nearby would lower their voices out of respect when discussing the island. Some traditions described strange behaviours among those who landed there, including rituals of circling the chapel on bent knees before leaving again for the mainland. Though many of these stories belonged more to folklore than recorded history, they reflected a wider truth that was impossible to ignore once the islands came into view. Eilean Mòr felt distant from ordinary life in a way that was difficult to describe. There were no permanent settlements, no trees, and no shelter from the Atlantic winds that struck the cliffs with relentless force throughout much of the year. During the 19th century, maritime traffic around Scotland's northern coast increased dramatically as commercial shipping expanded between the Atlantic and ports farther south. The waters around the Hebrides became crowded with fishing vessels, steamships, and cargo routes that passed dangerously close to submerged reefs and isolated rock formations. Lighthouse authorities received repeated warnings about the hazards near the Flannan Isles, particularly during winter storms when visibility could collapse without warning. By the 1890s, the Northern Lighthouse Board concluded that a major lighthouse station was necessary on Eilean Mòr to reduce the growing number of maritime accidents in the area. Construction began in 1895 under conditions that revealed immediately how hostile the island could become. Building materials had to be transported across rough seas and hauled up steep cliffs rising nearly 200 feet above the Atlantic. Workers blasted pathways through solid rock, constructed landing areas against the cliffs, and assembled living quarters capable of withstanding continuous exposure to wind and salt water. Reports from the period described enormous waves striking the island with enough force to throw spray far above the cliff edges, while storms frequently interrupted deliveries and delayed progress for days at a time. Even reaching the construction site safely depended entirely on weather conditions, and there were periods when boats could not land at all. The lighthouse itself was completed in 1899 and stood as a powerful symbol of modern engineering against one of the most unforgiving coastlines in Britain. Designed by David Allen Stevenson, a member of the famous Stevenson family of lighthouse engineers that included the ancestors of author Robert Louis Stevenson, the tower rose roughly 75 feet above the island while its light reached far across the surrounding waters. Alongside the tower stood living quarters, storage buildings, and narrow stone paths connecting the station across the exposed terrain. Supplies arrived periodically by ship, but during severe weather the keepers stationed there could remain cut off from the mainland for extended periods, with no communication beyond signal flags and passing vessels. Life at the lighthouse quickly developed a reputation for extreme loneliness. 3 men were assigned to the station at a time, rotating shifts through long periods of isolation broken only by occasional relief visits. Their responsibilities were strict and repetitive: maintaining the light, recording weather conditions, monitoring equipment, cleaning machinery, and remaining constantly alert for passing ships. The work demanded discipline because even a small mistake could place lives at risk along the surrounding coast. Yet beneath the routines of lighthouse service existed another challenge that was harder to measure. The men stationed on Eilean Mòr lived surrounded almost entirely by wind, sea, and silence. The Atlantic dominated every aspect of daily existence there. During winter months, storms rolled across the ocean with astonishing speed, striking the cliffs with impacts that could be heard from inside the station walls. The keepers often watched waves exploding against the rocks below, while heavy rain swept sideways across the island for hours at a time. Contemporary accounts from lighthouse workers elsewhere in Scotland described how isolation could slowly alter a man's sense of time and perspective, especially in stations where weeks might pass without meaningful human contact beyond the same 2 companions. On Eilean Mòr, the effect was intensified by geography itself. There was nowhere to walk beyond the island's exposed paths, nowhere to escape the sound of the sea, and nowhere to look except toward an endless horizon that often disappeared beneath mist. The 3 keepers assigned to the lighthouse near the end of 1900 were Principal Keeper James Ducat, Second Assistant Thomas Marshall, and Occasional Keeper Donald MacArthur. Ducat was regarded as experienced and dependable, while Marshall had developed a reputation as a capable lighthouse man with years of service behind him. MacArthur differed somewhat from the others. He was not originally scheduled as part of the permanent crew and was serving temporarily while another keeper remained absent on leave. Formerly employed as a sailor, MacArthur was known on the mainland for his temper and involvement in local fights, yet records also described him as physically strong and capable in dangerous conditions. Together, the 3 men occupied one of the most isolated workplaces in Britain as winter closed over the North Atlantic in December 1900. Supply vessels visited according to schedule when weather permitted, but storms increasingly surrounded the islands as the year drew toward its end. To passing ships, the lighthouse beams sweeping across the darkness each night became a reassuring sign that someone remained awake on the cliffs above the sea, carrying out the same routines hour after hour while the Atlantic crashed below them in the dark. Then, without warning, the routine inside the lighthouse began to change in ways that would later make several entries in the station log deeply unsettling to those who read them. The journal entries that disturbed investigators. Inside the lighthouse, nearly every written line followed a rigid purpose, long before anyone imagined those pages would later be examined for signs of fear. Lighthouse logs in the late 19th century were practical documents designed to preserve consistency inside some of the most isolated stations in Britain, and the men assigned to maintain them understood that every observation carried official importance. Weather conditions, visibility across the sea, equipment maintenance, supply deliveries, and the operation of the lantern itself were all carefully recorded according to the procedure established by the Northern Lighthouse Board. The entries were not intended to reveal emotion or personal reflection. In stations exposed to dangerous coastlines and violent weather, discipline mattered because lives at sea depended on it, and the written record reflected that discipline with a detached, methodical tone that rarely changed from one day to the next. Unlike private journals carried by sailors or travellers, the records maintained on Eilean Mòr existed mainly to preserve order within a station, where routine could mean the difference between safety and catastrophe. Every keeper was expected to follow strict schedules regardless of fatigue, weather, or isolation, and the logbook served as evidence that those responsibilities were being fulfilled correctly. Historians who later examined lighthouse procedures from the period noted how repetitive these records usually were, sometimes containing little more than brief remarks about wind direction, lamp maintenance, and passing vessels. For that reason, even slight deviations in tone attracted attention once the disappearance of the 3 keepers became known. Investigators searching for explanations found themselves reading and rereading the surviving reports connected to the station, attempting to understand whether the final entries reflected genuine events unfolding on the island or something far less certain shaped by later retelling. Among the surviving details connected to the final days on the island, few have provoked more discussion than the descriptions of weather reportedly entered during December of 1900. According to accounts that circulated after the disappearance, the keepers documented severe winds and unusually violent seas striking the island over several days. Some versions of the story describe conditions so intense that one of the men allegedly remarked that the storm was unlike anything he had witnessed in more than 2 decades at sea. The details appeared extraordinary, because experienced lighthouse keepers stationed around Scotland routinely endured brutal Atlantic weather without recording emotional reactions in official logs. Yet the precise wording of these entries has remained difficult to verify with certainty. Modern researchers have repeatedly pointed out that the original logbook itself was never publicly reproduced in full, leaving historians dependent on later summaries and newspaper reports that may not have preserved the entries exactly as written. What disturbed later readers was not simply the mention of rough seas, but the emotional tone attached to men who were already familiar with Atlantic storms. One widely repeated account claimed that Thomas Marshall, regarded as an experienced and dependable keeper, appeared deeply shaken by the weather surrounding the station. Another suggested that Donald MacArthur, whose reputation on the mainland involved physical toughness and a quick temper, had become strangely quiet during the reported storm. To later audiences, the contrast felt unsettling because these were not inexperienced men encountering harsh conditions for the first time. Lighthouse service along Scotland's western coast exposed keepers to freezing winds, enormous waves, and long periods of isolation as part of ordinary life. Even during dangerous weather, official records were expected to remain controlled and factual. Certain versions of the log describe Thomas Marshall as unusually quiet and deeply affected by conditions outside the station, an observation that stood apart from the restrained language expected in official lighthouse records. Marshall had spent years working in difficult maritime environments before arriving on Eilean Mòr, and surviving employment records gave no indication that he was considered unstable or unreliable. That reputation became important later because it made the emotional nature of the alleged entries appear even more unusual. Some retellings claimed that the men had prayed together inside the lighthouse, while storms battered the cliffs outside, a detail that dramatically shaped public fascination with the case in later decades. Yet historians remain divided over how much of this material originated from authentic records, and how much may have been added afterward as the mystery attracted wider attention across Britain. References connected to Donald MacArthur created even greater curiosity, because mainland accounts often portrayed him as combative, physically strong, and unlikely to appear intimidated by ordinary weather. MacArthur was serving temporarily on the island while another keeper remained absent, and unlike Ducat and Marshall, he was not considered part of the regular station crew. Local reports from Lewis described him as a man involved in fights ashore and known for confrontational behaviour, characteristics that later writers contrasted sharply with descriptions of fear supposedly recorded inside the lighthouse. Whether those details reflected reality or later exaggeration became increasingly difficult to determine as the story spread through newspapers, maritime discussions, and eventually popular folklore. What remained consistent, however, was the sense that investigators believed something had disrupted the emotional stability normally associated with experienced lighthouse men. For investigators attempting to reconstruct the final days on Eilean Mòr, the logs presented an unsettling contradiction between professional discipline and apparent emotional strain. Lighthouse keepers were trained to respond calmly to dangerous conditions because panic aboard an isolated station could quickly become disastrous. Their duties demanded concentration regardless of exhaustion or fear, especially during storms when visibility collapsed and ships depended heavily on the lighthouse beam to avoid hidden reefs. The idea that multiple keepers might simultaneously appear distressed raised questions that no official report could fully answer later. If the reported entries were accurate, investigators had to consider what circumstances could have unsettled all 3 men at once inside a station specifically designed to endure violent Atlantic weather. Meteorological reports gathered from nearby regions later complicated the mystery further, when researchers noticed that some recorded conditions did not fully align with descriptions attributed to the lighthouse entries. Weather observations from surrounding areas suggested that severe storms may not have struck the Flannan Isles, on the exact dates later associated with the reported journal passages. This discrepancy became one of the most debated aspects of the case, because it introduced uncertainty into nearly every interpretation that followed. Some historians argued that the storm descriptions may have been exaggerated afterward by journalists seeking dramatic details, while others believed local weather conditions around the islands could have differed significantly from reports gathered farther away. The North Atlantic was capable of producing sudden, localized violence, especially near exposed cliffs and isolated rock formations, and conditions at Eilean Mòr may not have been fully reflected in mainland records. During the decades that followed, historians and lighthouse experts repeatedly returned to the same unresolved question of whether the surviving wording represented authentic records or later embellishments shaped by retelling. The disappearance occurred at a moment when newspapers across Britain eagerly amplified mysterious maritime stories, particularly those involving isolated locations and unexplained vanishings. As the Flannan Isles case spread beyond Scotland, details became increasingly difficult to separate from speculation. Poems, articles, and later dramatisations often repeated the journal entries as unquestioned fact, even though researchers continued debating the reliability of the quotations themselves. Yet the uncertainty surrounding the entries ultimately deepened the mystery rather than weakening it. If the records were accurate, they suggested fear among men accustomed to danger. If they had been altered or romanticised later, the reason such additions felt believable still reflected the unsettling atmosphere surrounding the case from the very beginning. Beneath the uncertainty surrounding the exact phrasing, however, one fact remained impossible to dismiss. Something had interrupted the normal rhythm of life inside the station before contact with the mainland was suddenly lost. The final confirmed records from the lighthouse showed duties continuing as expected for a time, but at some point the predictable structure governing daily existence on Eilean Mòr collapsed without explanation. No further entries clarified what occurred afterward. No official message was sent requesting assistance. The lighthouse itself remained standing against the Atlantic winds while the silence inside it deepened unnoticed across the final days of December 1900. By the time the next relief vessel finally approached the cliffs of Eilean Mòr, the lighthouse had already fallen into a silence that no official report would ever fully explain. The supply ship that found an empty lighthouse. Several days passed before worsening weather finally allowed the relief vessel Hesperus to continue its scheduled journey toward the Flannan Isles in late December of 1900. Winter conditions across the North Atlantic had already disrupted ordinary operations throughout the region, and delays involving lighthouse supply routes were not unusual during that time of year. The Hesperus, operated by the Northern Lighthouse Board, carried supplies and replacement personnel between isolated stations scattered along Scotland's dangerous western coast, often navigating rough seas that made landing attempts difficult or impossible for days at a time. By the afternoon of December 26th, however, conditions had improved enough for the ship to approach Eilean Mòr and complete the long-postponed relief. From the mainland, nothing yet suggested that the lighthouse had become the centre of one of the most enduring maritime mysteries in British history. Aboard the ship was relief keeper Joseph Moore, who expected little more than another difficult landing on one of the loneliest stations maintained by the Northern Lighthouse Board. Moore had already worked in remote lighthouse environments and understood the demanding conditions surrounding the Flannan Isles. The assignment itself carried little novelty for experienced keepers accustomed to harsh weather, repetitive routines, and long stretches of isolation. Yet as the Hesperus drew closer to Eilean Mòr, Moore and the crew began noticing small irregularities that immediately separated the island from every ordinary relief operation they had encountered before. In lighthouse service, routine mattered enormously, because every station followed the same carefully observed procedures whenever a supply vessel approached. Even before anyone stepped ashore, those routines appeared to have broken down completely. Nothing unusual appeared at first as the outline of Eilean Mòr slowly emerged through the winter haze, its cliffs rising dark above the Atlantic surf. The lighthouse tower still stood against the skyline exactly as expected, and the sea surrounding the island showed none of the violence later associated with the disappearance. Yet as the Hesperus manoeuvred closer to the landing area, the absence of movement became increasingly difficult to ignore. Under normal circumstances, lighthouse keepers observing an approaching vessel would prepare immediately for arrival by signalling from the station or moving toward the landing platform below the cliffs. The men stationed there understood that unloading supplies and equipment often depended on narrow windows of favourable weather, particularly during winter months when conditions could change rapidly. On this occasion, however, no figure appeared near the pathways leading down from the lighthouse, and no signal flag rose into view. No answering signal greeted the Hesperus as it approached the island, despite long-established procedures requiring the keepers to acknowledge arriving vessels. Captain James Harvey, responsible for overseeing the relief operation, reportedly attempted to attract attention from the station using the ship's whistle and signal devices, but the cliffs above remained silent. The lack of response immediately created concern because even if weather conditions had delayed preparations, someone should have emerged once the ship drew near enough to be clearly visible from the lighthouse tower. The stillness surrounding Eilean Mòr felt increasingly unnatural, precisely because the station itself showed no obvious signs of damage. The lighthouse lantern structure remained intact above the cliffs, and the buildings appeared undisturbed from a distance, yet the human presence expected within them had vanished completely from sight. From the deck below, Captain James Harvey reportedly sensed almost immediately that the silence surrounding the station felt deeply wrong. Later accounts connected to the incident described the unusual atmosphere observed by the crew as they waited offshore, uncertain whether worsening weather, illness, or some accident had prevented the keepers from responding. Harvey eventually ordered Joseph Moore to go ashore and investigate directly, while members of the crew prepared the equipment necessary for landing beneath the steep western cliffs. Even under ordinary conditions, reaching the island required careful timing, because Atlantic swells battered the rocks continuously below the narrow landing platform. The isolation of Eilean Mòr meant that if an emergency had occurred on the island, there would have been no nearby assistance and no immediate way for the keepers to contact the mainland once communication stopped. Carrying only the necessary equipment for the climb, Joseph Moore began ascending the steep pathway toward the lighthouse, while the crew waited uneasily near the landing area. The stone steps cut into the cliffs twisted upward through cold Atlantic wind, and with each section of the climb the absence of activity became harder to explain. No voices carried from the station buildings above, no doors opened in response to his approach. According to Moore's later testimony, the silence itself created growing unease long before he reached the lighthouse compound. Experienced keepers were expected to remain alert for arriving vessels, because supply schedules governed nearly every aspect of life at isolated stations, and Moore understood that something serious must have occurred for all three men to abandon their duties simultaneously. Behind the closed entrance doors, the station appeared strangely orderly in ways that only intensified the growing alarm among those searching the buildings. Moore discovered that the main gate and doors had been secured, suggesting there had been no panic inside the station immediately before the disappearance. Once he entered the living quarters, however, the unnatural stillness became impossible to ignore. The rooms showed signs of recent occupation, yet there was no indication that anyone remained there. Lamps had been cleaned and refilled according to routine procedure. The beds appeared undisturbed, and much of the station looked exactly as it should have during an ordinary working day. What disturbed Moore most was not evidence of violence or destruction, but the overwhelming impression that daily life had ended abruptly without explanation. One of the first details noted inside the quarters involved the heavy oilskin coats normally worn outdoors during storms, because one still remained hanging where it should have been. Investigators later considered this detail especially significant, since lighthouse keepers almost never ventured outside during dangerous weather without proper protective clothing. The fact that one coat remained inside suggested the possibility that at least one of the men may have left the station unexpectedly or in haste. Yet even this observation created contradictions rather than answers. If an emergency had occurred near the cliffs, why would experienced keepers expose themselves to Atlantic conditions without full equipment? And if only one man initially left the lighthouse, what compelled the others to follow? Across the kitchen and sleeping areas, everyday objects seemed frozen in the middle of ordinary routine, with no obvious signs of struggle or panic visible anywhere in the station. Reports connected to the investigation later described overturned chairs and partially completed meals, though historians continue debating the accuracy of some of these details, because newspaper accounts often introduced embellishments as the story spread. What remains historically supported is the broader impression documented by those who entered the lighthouse after the disappearance. The station looked abandoned suddenly rather than gradually. Clocks had reportedly stopped, household items remained where they were normally used, and the keepers themselves had vanished without leaving any direct explanation behind. The contrast between orderly surroundings and total human absence transformed the lighthouse into something far more unsettling than a conventional maritime accident scene. Along the cliffs below the western landing platform, investigators soon discovered severe storm damage that suggested enormous waves had recently struck parts of the island with tremendous force. Equipment stored above sea level had been displaced or broken apart, ropes were damaged, and evidence indicated that powerful Atlantic swells had battered the western side of Eilean Mòr during recent storms. These discoveries would later form the foundation of the official explanation proposed by Lighthouse authorities, who believed the keepers may have been swept into the sea while attempting to secure equipment during dangerous weather. Yet even this theory failed to answer several troubling details completely. Experienced lighthouse men understood the risks posed by Atlantic storms, and station regulations discouraged unnecessary exposure to the cliffs during extreme conditions. The absence of bodies or definitive physical evidence only deepened uncertainty surrounding what had occurred. Search efforts continued around Eilean Mòr for traces of the missing keepers, yet the surrounding rocks and shoreline revealed nothing that could fully explain how 3 experienced men had vanished together. The sea surrounding the island remained capable of erasing evidence quickly, especially during winter weather, but the complete absence of survivors, bodies, or witnesses ensured that investigators could reconstruct events only through scattered physical clues left behind inside the station. Over time, the emptiness discovered by the Hesperus crew became one of the defining features of the mystery itself. There was no final message, no direct account of an accident, and no clear indication of what sequence of events had drawn the men from the safety of the lighthouse into the violent Atlantic darkness outside. What remained inside the lighthouse after the search ended would trouble investigators almost as much as the disappearance itself. Clues, frozen in place. Scattered throughout the lighthouse were ordinary objects that seemed to preserve the final rhythm of daily life more clearly than any surviving testimony ever could. After the initial shock surrounding the disappearance of the 3 keepers began to settle, investigators and later researchers found themselves returning repeatedly to the physical details left behind inside the station. Unlike many maritime disasters, the Flannan Isles case produced no eyewitness accounts, no recovered bodies, and no definitive sequence of events explaining what had occurred on Eilean Mòr during the final days of December 1900. What remained instead was a collection of interrupted routines preserved inside one of the most isolated workplaces in Britain, where every object appeared to suggest movement and sudden absence at the same time. The mystery endured partly because the lighthouse itself seemed less like an abandoned building than a place where ordinary activity had stopped in the middle of continuing. Within the living quarters, investigators encountered an unsettling contrast between careful maintenance and complete human absence. Lighthouse stations operated according to strict standards enforced by the Northern Lighthouse Board, and the condition of the Flannan Isles station reflected that discipline even after the keepers vanished. Lamps had reportedly been cleaned and prepared properly, equipment remained organised, and much of the interior showed no obvious signs of confusion or violence. The beds were in order, the kitchen appeared recently used, and the daily responsibilities expected of experienced keepers had apparently continued normally until shortly before the disappearance. This atmosphere of preserved routine disturbed investigators because accidents involving isolated stations usually left behind clearer evidence of disruption. On Eilean Mòr, however, the environment inside the lighthouse felt strangely untouched, as though the men responsible for maintaining it had intended to return within moments. Hanging beside the entrance, one remaining oilskin coat quickly became one of the most discussed details connected to the disappearance. Heavy oilskins were essential protective garments for lighthouse keepers working outdoors during severe Atlantic weather, particularly near the exposed western landing platform where storms regularly battered the cliffs with enormous force. According to reports connected to the investigation, 2 oilskins appeared to be missing while one remained inside the station. This observation immediately created uncertainty because it suggested that at least one of the keepers may have gone outside without proper storm clothing. Experienced lighthouse men rarely exposed themselves to dangerous weather carelessly, especially on an island where Atlantic winds and waves could become lethal within minutes. The coat left behind therefore seemed to contradict the behaviour investigators would normally expect from trained keepers, familiar with the dangers surrounding Eilean Mòr. Far from being a trivial observation, the missing protective clothing raised difficult questions about why experienced keepers would expose themselves to Atlantic conditions without proper preparation. One possibility considered later was that a single keeper initially left the lighthouse for routine work or to respond to some emergency near the landing area, prompting the others to follow quickly afterward without taking time to fully equip themselves. Another theory suggested that deteriorating weather conditions may have created sudden urgency involving the station's equipment or supply crane. Yet every reconstruction encountered the same problem. The men stationed at Eilean Mòr were not inexperienced workers prone to reckless decisions. James Ducat and Thomas Marshall had years of lighthouse service behind them, and even Donald MacArthur, despite his temporary assignment, possessed maritime experience shaped by dangerous environments. The physical evidence seemed to imply haste or emergency, but the exact nature of that emergency remained impossible to identify with certainty. Stories describing untouched meals and overturned chairs soon began circulating far beyond the Flannan Isles, although historians later questioned how accurately some of those details had been reported. Newspaper coverage of the disappearance spread rapidly after news reached the mainland, and dramatic descriptions of abandoned dining tables or chairs knocked sideways became deeply attached to the public imagination surrounding the mystery. Modern researchers have noted that some of these claims cannot be verified conclusively through surviving official records and may have been amplified through retelling over time. Yet the persistence of those details revealed something important about the psychological effect of the case itself. The image of a meal interrupted suddenly inside a remote lighthouse carried a particular emotional weight, because it suggested normal human activity halted without warning, leaving behind evidence of presence but no explanation for absence. Even where later embellishments may have altered the story, the station still contained enough genuine irregularities to disturb seasoned investigators familiar with lighthouse accidents. Reports connected to the official inquiry consistently emphasised the strange condition in which the station had been found. Nothing indicated theft, violent struggle, or catastrophic structural damage inside the lighthouse itself. The lantern remained operational according to normal procedures before the light eventually failed to appear during the keeper's disappearance, and many household items remained exactly where they would ordinarily have been used. The silence described by Joseph Moore after entering the station became one of the defining emotional impressions associated with the case, because the lighthouse appeared neither destroyed nor deserted in any conventional sense. It felt inhabited by routine while completely emptied of the men responsible for maintaining it. Down near the western landing area, physical evidence revealed the immense force recent storms had exerted against the cliffs of Eilean Mòr. The western side of the island faced directly into the Atlantic and absorbed the full impact of winter seas, driven across enormous distances by ocean winds. Investigators discovered that storage boxes positioned high above sea level had been displaced, ropes damaged, and parts of the landing equipment broken or twisted by violent wave action. Contemporary descriptions of the damage suggested that enormous seas had swept across sections of the cliffs with terrifying power. Later visitors to the Flannan Isles noted how exposed the western landing remained during rough conditions, where sudden waves could rise unexpectedly against the rocks below and throw spray far above the pathways leading back toward the lighthouse. Broken storage equipment, displaced ropes, and damage to the supply crane suggested that unusually powerful seas had struck parts of the island shortly before the men vanished. These observations formed the foundation of the official explanation eventually accepted by lighthouse authorities, who concluded that the keepers may have been attempting to secure equipment during dangerous weather when one or more men were swept into the sea. According to this interpretation, the others may have rushed to assist after witnessing an accident, resulting in all three disappearing together. On the surface, the theory appeared plausible, because Atlantic storms around the Hebrides were fully capable of producing waves strong enough to destroy heavy equipment and carry men into the ocean without leaving recoverable remains. Yet investigators still struggled to reconcile certain details with standard lighthouse procedure. Regulations generally discouraged all three keepers from leaving the station simultaneously, particularly during severe conditions, since maintaining operation of the light remained essential even during storms. Attempts to reconstruct the final movements of the three keepers repeatedly led investigators toward explanations that solved one detail while creating uncertainty around another. If the men had gone outside together in response to damaged equipment, why did one oilskin remain inside? If one keeper had been swept away accidentally, what circumstances convinced the others to expose themselves to the same danger immediately afterward? And if extraordinary weather had caused the tragedy, why did some regional weather records later appear less severe than descriptions connected to the island itself? Each physical clue seemed capable of supporting multiple interpretations depending on the sequence imagined by investigators. Over time, the case became less a straightforward disappearance and more a puzzle built from incomplete fragments that refused to align perfectly into a single narrative. Unlike many maritime disasters that leave behind wreckage, witnesses, or recoverable remains, the Flannan Isles case offered only fragments of interrupted routine scattered across an isolated station. The absence of direct evidence allowed speculation to expand steadily across the decades that followed, drawing historians, writers, and paranormal theorists into arguments about what truly happened on Eilean Mòr. Yet even the most dramatic theories often returned eventually to the same quiet physical details discovered inside the lighthouse itself. A coat hanging near the doorway, equipment damaged beside the cliffs, rooms left in careful order. The mystery persisted not because the station contained spectacular evidence, but because its ordinary objects seemed permanently suspended between explanation and uncertainty. Long after official searches ended, researchers continued returning to the same silent collection of objects because the physical evidence never settled comfortably into a single explanation. Each clue appeared meaningful while remaining incomplete, and together they created an atmosphere that felt strangely resistant to certainty. More than a century later, the disappearance of the three keepers still lingers in maritime history, partly because the lighthouse preserved traces of human routine without preserving the event that interrupted it. The station on Eilean Mòr became a place where ordinary details acquired extraordinary weight simply because nobody could explain why they had been left behind exactly as they were. Questions surrounding the weather itself would soon complicate the mystery even further, the storms that should not have been there. By the early stages of the investigation, even the weather surrounding Eilean Mòr had begun to resist clear explanation. For lighthouse authorities attempting to reconstruct the disappearance of the three keepers, storms initially appeared to provide the most logical answer. The Flannan Isles stood exposed to one of the harshest maritime environments in Britain, where Atlantic waves regularly struck the cliffs with enough force to damage heavy equipment positioned far above sea level. The physical destruction discovered near the western landing platform seemed entirely consistent with violent winter seas, and investigators naturally assumed that dangerous weather had played a central role in the tragedy. Yet as researchers later examined surviving records more closely, the timeline surrounding those storms became increasingly difficult to reconcile with some of the most unsettling details associated with the case. Careful observation of wind and sea conditions formed an essential part of lighthouse routine throughout the Scottish coast during the 19th century. Lighthouse keepers were expected to document changing weather patterns, not only for operational purposes but also because maritime safety depended heavily on accurate knowledge of Atlantic conditions. Wind direction, sea state, visibility, and storm activity were routinely recorded across stations positioned along dangerous coastlines, where sudden weather shifts could place ships in immediate danger. The keepers stationed at Eilean Mòr understood these responsibilities well, particularly because the Flannan Isles occupied an isolated position directly exposed to storms moving eastward across the North Atlantic. Under ordinary circumstances, the weather records connected to the lighthouse should therefore have provided investigators with a relatively clear understanding of the conditions leading up to the disappearance. Accounts connected to the final entries from the Flannan Isles station described unusually violent conditions developing around the island in the days before the disappearance. Later reports repeated claims that severe winds battered the station for several days, while enormous seas struck the cliffs below the lighthouse. Some versions of the story described the men reacting with unusual anxiety as conditions worsened, while one famous account claimed that Thomas Marshall referred to a storm unlike any he had previously encountered during his years at sea. These descriptions eventually became central to the popular understanding of the mystery because they appeared to establish a direct emotional connection between the keepers and the dangerous weather surrounding the island. If the reports were accurate, they suggested that experienced lighthouse men had become deeply unsettled by something unfolding outside the station. What drew lasting attention from later researchers was the apparent intensity of emotion associated with those reported descriptions of bad weather. Lighthouse keepers working around Scotland's western coast regularly face storms powerful enough to isolate stations for days or even weeks at a time, and official logs were generally expected to remain calm and procedural regardless of conditions outside. The emotional tone connected to the Flannan Isles entries therefore appeared strikingly abnormal. Stories describing fear, prayer, or visible distress among seasoned keepers quickly shaped public fascination with the case, because they implied that something about the weather on Eilean Mòr felt unusually threatening, even to men accustomed to Atlantic violence. Yet the deeper investigators examined these reports, the more uncertain the underlying evidence became. Records gathered from nearby locations along the Hebrides, however, complicated the accepted timeline once investigators compared them against the conditions supposedly described at the lighthouse. Weather observations recorded on Lewis and surrounding islands did not initially appear to reflect storms severe enough to match some of the dramatic descriptions later associated with the final lighthouse entries. This contradiction became one of the most debated aspects of the case, because it introduced uncertainty into the very explanation authorities considered most plausible. If nearby regions had not experienced extraordinary weather during the relevant period, why did later accounts connected to Eilean Mòr describe such terrifying conditions? The discrepancy forced researchers to consider whether the reported entries had been altered through retelling, misunderstood during early investigations, or shaped by newspaper exaggeration after the disappearance became public knowledge. Rather than confirming a massive regional storm immediately, some meteorological observations suggested calmer weather across surrounding areas during part of the period in question. Modern historians examining available records have pointed out that the most severe weather appears to have developed later than some of the famous journal descriptions would suggest. This inconsistency did not necessarily eliminate the possibility of dangerous conditions around Eilean Mòr itself, but it weakened the sense of certainty surrounding the official narrative. The Atlantic Ocean surrounding the Flannan Isles was capable of producing highly localized violence, particularly near steep cliffs where waves and wind patterns behaved unpredictably. Even so, the idea that experienced keepers expressed unusual fear before nearby weather stations recorded truly severe storms created a lingering sense that part of the timeline remained incomplete. Debates surrounding these contradictions eventually became one of the most persistent features of the entire Flannan Isles mystery. Some researchers argued that later newspaper reports transformed ordinary storm observations into dramatic psychological evidence because the disappearance itself demanded explanation. Others believed the emotional language attributed to the keepers may have reflected genuine conditions unique to the island, rather than regional weather patterns recorded farther away. The uncertainty surrounding the logs only intensified these disagreements, because historians lacked access to a fully verified version of every reported entry connected to the station. Over time, the weather itself became less a clear explanation than another unstable layer of evidence that investigators struggled to interpret with confidence. Localized Atlantic storms remained fully capable of producing sudden and destructive seas near isolated cliffs even when neighbouring regions experienced less severe conditions. The western side of Eilean Mòr faced directly into open ocean, and lighthouse workers familiar with the Hebrides understood how quickly dangerous swells could emerge without warning near exposed rock formations. Rogue seas, rapidly shifting winds, and violent surf patterns were all well-documented hazards throughout the region. Investigators examining the damaged landing area after the disappearance found physical evidence consistent with powerful wave impacts, including displaced equipment and destruction near the western cliffs. These observations supported the possibility that the keepers encountered conditions far more dangerous than those reflected in mainland weather reports alone. Beyond ordinary weather systems, investigators also considered the possibility that rogue waves may have struck the western landing unexpectedly with devastating force. Maritime records from the North Atlantic contain numerous accounts of abnormal waves appearing suddenly in otherwise manageable conditions, particularly around isolated rock formations where underwater geography could amplify sea movement unpredictably. If one or more keepers had descended toward the landing area during worsening weather, a sudden wave powerful enough to sweep men from the cliffs remained entirely possible. Yet even this explanation failed to resolve every uncertainty surrounding the case. Questions persisted regarding why all three men appeared to have left the lighthouse simultaneously, why one oilskin remained inside, and why the emotional tone associated with the final reported entries seemed so disproportionate to the broader regional weather record. Questions persisted because every attempt to stabilize the timeline still left uncertainty surrounding the emotional atmosphere reportedly recorded inside the lighthouse. The further researchers moved into the details surrounding storms, dates, and conflicting observations, the more the case seemed to resist complete reconstruction. The Atlantic environment surrounding Eilean Mòr undoubtedly possessed the power to destroy equipment and kill experienced men without leaving recoverable evidence behind. Yet the strange combination of fearful journal accounts, disputed meteorological records, and unexplained procedural irregularities prevented the disappearance from settling comfortably into the category of ordinary maritime accident. Instead, the mystery continued drifting between plausible explanations and unresolved contradictions. Long after official inquiries concluded, historians continued examining weather reports, lighthouse procedures, and maritime records in hopes of reconciling details that never aligned completely. The storms surrounding the disappearance became haunting, not simply because they may have caused the deaths of the three keepers, but because investigators could never establish with certainty exactly when the most dangerous conditions truly arrived around Eilean Mòr. In a case already defined by silence and absence, even the weather itself appeared strangely unstable, shifting between documented fact and uncertain interpretation, depending on which surviving records investigators trusted most. Few people connected to the mystery carried those unresolved impressions more heavily than Joseph Mòr after his first lonely walk into the abandoned station. Joseph Mòr's haunted search. For Joseph Mòr, the mystery of Eilean Mòr did not end once the empty lighthouse had been discovered. Long after investigators debated storms, damaged equipment, and disputed journal entries, Mòr remained permanently connected to the moment the silence inside the station first revealed itself to another human being. Among all those involved in the case, he occupied a uniquely unsettling position because he was neither a distant official nor a later commentator attempting to reconstruct events from reports and speculation. He was the first man forced to walk alone into a place where routine had stopped without explanation. In the years that followed, the emotional weight carried by his testimony helped shape the atmosphere surrounding the Flannan Isles mystery almost as strongly as the physical evidence itself. Assigned as the relief keeper scheduled to replace one of the missing men, Mòr arrived at the island expecting to continue the ordinary routines of lighthouse service. Relief operations formed a standard part of life within the Northern Lighthouse Board system, where men rotated through difficult stations according to carefully planned schedules shaped by weather and supply conditions. The work demanded discipline and emotional steadiness because lighthouse keepers often spent long periods isolated from mainland communities while performing repetitive but essential duties. Mòr already understood these realities before boarding the Hesperus in December 1900. Nothing about the assignment initially suggested that Eilean Mòr would soon become one of the most famous unsolved disappearances in British maritime history. Ascending the steep cliff path alone, he moved toward a station that should already have been preparing for the arrival of the Hesperus below. The route from the landing platform climbed sharply upward along exposed stone steps carved into the island, winding toward the lighthouse compound above the Atlantic surf. Under ordinary circumstances, at least one keeper would have been visible long before Mòr reached the buildings, either signalling from the station or assisting preparations for unloading supplies from the relief vessel. Instead, every stage of the climb reinforced the same growing absence. No movement appeared near the pathways. No voices carried across the wind. The island itself seemed suspended in stillness despite the arrival of the ship offshore, and with each step Mòr moved deeper into a silence that no longer felt ordinary. Silence accompanied Mòr from the landing platform to the lighthouse buildings in a manner he would later remember with particular unease. The isolation of lighthouse service meant that quiet itself was not unusual, especially on remote Atlantic stations where only the sea, wind, and mechanical routines of the light interrupted long stretches of solitude. Yet the silence surrounding Eilean Mòr carried a different emotional quality, because it existed where human activity should have been visible. The keepers stationed there had responsibilities governed by precise schedules and procedures, and Mòr immediately recognized that those procedures had collapsed before the Hesperus ever reached the island. Later discussions surrounding the case often returned to this emotional atmosphere because experienced lighthouse men were trained to notice disruptions in routine instinctively, and Mòr appears to have sensed that something was profoundly wrong before he even entered the station itself. Inside the station quarters, the absence of human movement appeared far more disturbing than any visible sign of destruction could have been. Mòr reportedly found rooms that looked recently occupied, yet entirely abandoned at the same time, creating the unsettling impression that daily activity had ended suddenly without warning. Lamps had been maintained correctly, furniture remained largely undisturbed, and ordinary domestic details continued to suggest the recent presence of the three keepers. Yet nobody responded to his calls inside the compound. No explanation waited in the rooms beyond the incomplete fragments of routine left behind throughout the station. Historians examining later accounts of the discovery have frequently noted that the power of the case emerged partly from this strange combination of order and disappearance. The lighthouse itself did not resemble the aftermath of catastrophe. Instead, it resembled a place where people had vanished directly out of ordinary life. According to later accounts connected to the investigation, Mòr became deeply shaken by the atmosphere he encountered within the lighthouse after realizing all three keepers were gone. Some reports suggested he crossed himself repeatedly while searching the station, while others described him as visibly disturbed even after returning to the Hesperus. Modern historians remain cautious regarding the accuracy of certain dramatic details attached to the story over time, especially because newspaper accounts often amplified emotional reactions surrounding the case. Even so, surviving descriptions consistently portray Mòr as profoundly affected by what he discovered on Eilean Mòr. This reaction carried significance because lighthouse keepers were not unfamiliar with isolation, harsh weather, or maritime accidents. The emotional effect the station produced on Mòr therefore appeared notable, precisely because it came from a man already accustomed to difficult environments. Rather than leaving immediately after the discovery, Mòr remained connected to the station during the difficult days that followed the search for the missing men. The lighthouse itself still required operation despite the disappearance, and arrangements had to be made to maintain the light while investigations continued around the island. This practical reality forced Mòr to remain within the same isolated environment, where the three keepers had vanished, surrounded by unanswered questions and physical traces of interrupted routine. Contemporary accounts suggest the experience placed considerable strain on him emotionally. Living and working inside the abandoned station meant confronting the silence repeatedly, while uncertainty surrounding the fate of the missing men deepened around him. Life on isolated lighthouse stations already demanded unusual psychological endurance, even under normal circumstances along the Scottish coast. Keepers stationed on remote islands endured long separations from mainland society, repetitive routines shaped by weather and darkness, and constant exposure to Atlantic storms capable of isolating stations for days at a time. Historians studying lighthouse service have noted how strongly the environment could affect emotional well-being, particularly during winter months when rough seas prevented relief vessels from arriving on schedule. The Flannan Isles amplified these pressures through extreme remoteness. Eilean Mòr stood surrounded not by nearby villages or visible coastal traffic, but by open Atlantic water stretching toward the horizon in every direction. For Mòr, remaining on the island after discovering the disappearance meant existing within an environment already associated with unexplained absence and growing public fascination. Reports describing Mòr's later experiences on Eilean Mòr suggested that the emotional weight of the disappearance lingered long after the initial investigation had begun. Some later retellings claimed he heard voices carried through the station, or believed the missing keepers still lingered in memory around the lighthouse, though historians debate how much of this material originated from reliable testimony and how much developed through folklore surrounding the case. What appears historically clear is that Mòr found the experience deeply distressing. The combination of isolation, silence, and unresolved uncertainty surrounding the disappearance created conditions uniquely suited to shaping long-lasting emotional impressions. Over time, his reactions became part of the broader mythology surrounding the Flannan Isles, because they offered something more difficult to dismiss than rumour or speculation, the testimony of a trained lighthouse keeper visibly unsettled by what he encountered inside the station. Years afterward, discussion surrounding the Flannan Isles mystery continued returning to Mòr's reactions because he remained the first witness to confront the station's unexplained silence directly. Physical evidence could be debated, journal entries questioned, and weather reports interpreted in different ways, but Mòr's emotional response remained harder to categorize neatly. He entered the lighthouse expecting an ordinary human routine, and instead encountered an absence so complete that it continued haunting discussions of the case more than a century later. In many respects, his experience shaped the emotional memory of Eilean Mòr itself, transforming the lighthouse from a site of probable maritime tragedy into something far more psychologically unsettling. More than any disputed journal entry or damaged piece of equipment, the emotional effect the lighthouse appeared to leave on Joseph Mòr made the official explanation increasingly difficult for some investigators to accept completely. The official explanation begins to fracture. As public attention surrounding the disappearance intensified across Britain, authorities moved quickly to establish a practical explanation for the fate of the three keepers. The mystery of Eilean Mòr had already begun spreading beyond maritime circles by the time official investigators completed their earliest examinations of the island, and the circumstances surrounding the abandoned lighthouse naturally invited public speculation. 3 experienced men had vanished from an isolated station without witnesses, recoverable remains, or any final account explaining what had happened near the western cliffs. Under those conditions, the Northern Lighthouse Board faced pressure not only to investigate the disappearance thoroughly, but also to provide a conclusion capable of restoring confidence in lighthouse operations throughout Scotland's dangerous western coast. The need for a rational explanation became increasingly important as newspapers transformed the incident into one of the most discussed maritime mysteries of the period. Responsibility for investigating the incident fell largely upon the Northern Lighthouse Board, whose conclusions carried enormous importance for confidence in lighthouse operations along the Scottish coast. Robert Muirhead, a superintendent connected to the board, eventually travelled to Eilean Mòr to inspect the station personally and examine the conditions surrounding the disappearance. His findings would shape the official narrative that followed for decades afterward. Lighthouse authorities already understood the severe risks surrounding the Flannan Isles, where Atlantic storms regularly battered exposed landing platforms and damaged equipment positioned high above the sea. Any suggestion that something inexplicable had occurred at the station threatened not only the reputation of the board itself, but also public trust in the men responsible for maintaining some of Britain's most dangerous maritime outposts. In practical terms, investigators needed an explanation grounded firmly within the known hazards of lighthouse service. Initial examinations of the damaged western landing area appeared to support the theory that violent Atlantic waves had swept the men into the sea during dangerous weather. Investigators documented signs of recent storm destruction near the western cliffs, including displaced storage boxes, damaged ropes, and evidence that enormous waves had struck areas well above ordinary sea level. The Atlantic Ocean surrounding Eilean Mòr possessed more than enough force to carry men from exposed pathways without leaving bodies or recoverable evidence behind, particularly during winter storms when visibility collapsed and the sea became violently unpredictable. Based on the physical damage discovered around the landing area, the official conclusion gradually formed around the idea that one or more keepers had descended to secure equipment during worsening conditions before being swept away by sudden waves. According to this reconstruction, the remaining men may have attempted a rescue and suffered the same fate moments later. At first glance, the official reconstruction seemed entirely plausible within an environment already notorious for sudden storms and lethal cliffs. Lighthouse keepers throughout the Hebrides understood how quickly Atlantic conditions could become fatal near exposed landing platforms, especially during winter when heavy seas struck the islands with extraordinary force. The western side of Eilean Mòr faced directly into open ocean, leaving the cliffs vulnerable to waves capable of destroying heavy equipment positioned far above the waterline. Maritime history across Scotland contained numerous examples of sailors, fishermen, and coastal workers disappearing into violent seas without witnesses or recoverable remains. To many observers, the official explanation therefore appeared not only reasonable but inevitable. The Atlantic itself seemed fully capable of swallowing the three keepers without leaving behind anything except damaged equipment and unanswered questions. Doubts began emerging, however, when later researchers questioned why all three keepers would have abandoned the station simultaneously despite established lighthouse procedure. Lighthouse regulations generally discouraged every keeper from leaving the station at the same time, particularly during dangerous weather when maintaining operation of the light remained essential for maritime safety. Under ordinary conditions, at least one man would typically remain inside the lighthouse, while others worked outside near the cliffs or landing areas. The possibility that all three keepers descended together during severe weather therefore introduced uncertainty into the official reconstruction. If one man encountered difficulty near the western landing, it remained possible that the others rushed to assist instinctively. Yet even this explanation raised difficult questions about timing, procedure, and the decisions made by experienced men already familiar with the island's dangers. Additional uncertainty surrounded the oilskin coat reportedly left hanging inside the station, since experienced keepers rarely exposed themselves to severe conditions without protective clothing. Investigators and later historians repeatedly returned to this detail because it implied haste or interruption, rather than deliberate preparation. If the weather outside had already become violent enough to threaten the landing area seriously, why would one keeper leave the station improperly equipped? Some researchers suggested that the men may initially have expected only a brief task near the cliffs, before conditions deteriorated suddenly. Others believed the detail may have been exaggerated or inaccurately reported through later retellings of the case. Yet regardless of interpretation, the remaining oilskin became one more small inconsistency that prevented the official explanation from settling comfortably into certainty. Over time, conflicting interpretations of the weather records weakened confidence further by complicating the timeline attached to the official account. Meteorological observations gathered from nearby regions did not always appear consistent with some of the dramatic storm descriptions later associated with the Lighthouse journal entries. Researchers studying the case decades afterward noticed that the most severe regional weather may have developed later than the emotional reports connected to the keepers themselves seemed to suggest. This discrepancy did not eliminate the possibility of dangerous local conditions around Eilean Mòr, since Atlantic seas near isolated cliffs could become violently unpredictable, even during less severe regional weather. Nevertheless, the contradictions gradually transformed the case from a tragic but understandable maritime accident into something more unstable and difficult to reconstruct with confidence. Lack of recoverable bodies or direct eyewitness testimony ensured that every conclusion surrounding the disappearance depended heavily upon reconstruction rather than certainty. Unlike conventional accidents where physical evidence allows investigators to establish a clear sequence of events, the Flannan Isles case forced authorities to build explanations almost entirely from absence, damaged equipment, and scattered traces of interrupted routine. No survivor described what occurred near the western landing. No final message clarified the keeper's intentions before leaving the lighthouse. The sea itself preserved silence around the most important moments investigators needed to understand. As a result, every theory surrounding the disappearance ultimately depended upon interpretation rather than direct proof, leaving room for doubt even within the official explanation accepted by lighthouse authorities. Subsequent writers, historians, and maritime researchers repeatedly returned to the case, because the accepted explanation appeared to resolve the tragedy logically, while leaving important emotional and procedural questions unanswered. The wave accident theory explained how experienced men could disappear suddenly on such a dangerous island, yet it struggled to account fully for the unsettling emotional atmosphere surrounding the final reported journal entries, the unusual procedural irregularities inside the station, and the lingering psychological impact described by Joseph Moore afterward. Over the decades, this imbalance between practical explanation and emotional uncertainty became one of the defining characteristics of the mystery itself. The official conclusion remained plausible enough to survive scrutiny, but never complete enough to silence continuing fascination. Far from fading quietly into maritime history, the disappearance on Eilean Mòr gradually evolved into one of Scotland's most enduring unresolved mysteries, precisely because the evidence resisted complete closure. Each generation of researchers seemed to rediscover the same pattern. Every clue supported the official explanation in some ways, while simultaneously introducing new contradictions elsewhere. Physical damage suggested violent seas, yet weather records remained uncertain. Lighthouse procedure implied discipline, yet details inside the station suggested disruption. The emotional reactions attributed to the keepers appeared deeply unsettling, yet the reliability of those accounts remained disputed. Rather than collapsing under investigation, the mystery endured because certainty itself seemed impossible to maintain for long. Long before later theories introduced supernatural speculation, local traditions surrounding the Flannan Isles had already shaped how many people viewed the island itself, the island the keepers were warned about. Hidden far beyond the main shipping routes of the Hebrides, the Flannan Isles carried an uneasy reputation among coastal communities well before the Lighthouse era began. The cluster of rocky islands stood isolated in the Atlantic west of Lewis, surrounded by waters capable of changing from calm to violent within hours, and for generations they remained largely separated from ordinary settlement despite their visibility from passing maritime routes. Fishermen occasionally travelled near the islands during seasonal voyages, yet Eilean Mòr in particular developed an atmosphere shaped as much by distance and silence as by geography itself. By the time the lighthouse was completed at the end of the 19th century, the island already existed within local memory as a place associated with caution, isolation, and traditions older than the station that would eventually make it famous across Britain. Dedicated to St. Flannan, Eilean Mòr preserved traces of religious history that remained visible on the island long after earlier visitors had disappeared from its shores. Ruins of a small chapel connected to the Irish saint stood on the island centuries before lighthouse construction began, reflecting the deep religious traditions that once shaped remote communities throughout the Hebrides. St. Flannan himself was associated with early Christianity in Scotland and Ireland, and islands carrying religious significance often became intertwined with local customs and inherited beliefs over generations. Historical records suggest that shepherds occasionally used the Flannan Isles for grazing sheep during certain seasons, though permanent habitation never developed there in the ordinary sense. The combination of religious ruins, geographic isolation, and long periods without sustained human presence gradually gave Eilean Mòr a distinct identity within regional memory, long before the disappearance of the keepers transformed the island into an international mystery. Sailors approaching the islands in earlier generations sometimes observed quiet rituals of respect shaped by inherited local tradition. Accounts connected to the Hebrides describe customs in which visitors treated certain remote islands with unusual care, often influenced by a mixture of religious belief, maritime superstition, and oral tradition passed between coastal communities. Some reports associated with Eilean Mòr claim that visitors removed hats upon approaching the island or avoided speaking loudly near particular sites connected to older religious structures. Historians remain cautious about determining how widespread or consistent such customs truly were, particularly because folklore surrounding the Flannan Isles expanded significantly after the disappearance. Even so, the persistence of these traditions revealed something important about how isolated islands were perceived historically across Scotland's western coast. Places shaped by dangerous seas and limited human contact often accumulated layers of symbolic meaning that extended far beyond their physical geography. Throughout the outer reaches of western Scotland, remote islands often became deeply connected to stories born from dangerous seas and geographic isolation. Before modern communication systems linked distant coastal communities more closely together, islands scattered across the Atlantic existed at the edge of both physical and psychological distance. Storms could isolate settlements for days or weeks, while disappearances at sea frequently occurred without witnesses or recoverable evidence. Under such conditions, oral storytelling became one of the primary ways communities interpreted tragedy, danger, and uncertainty. Legends surrounding unusual weather, mysterious lights, spiritual warnings, or unexplained disappearances emerged naturally within environments where the sea itself often appeared unpredictable and unforgiving. The Flannan Isles formed part of this broader cultural landscape long before lighthouse keepers ever arrived there. Among communities familiar with Atlantic fishing routes, Eilean Mòr gradually acquired a reputation as a place approached with unusual caution. Some traditions connected to the island reflected practical concerns, shaped by its severe environment rather than purely supernatural belief. The cliffs surrounding the Flannan Isles were steep and hazardous, landing conditions frequently dangerous, and Atlantic weather capable of shifting rapidly around the exposed rock formations. Fishermen working near the islands understood how quickly routine activity could become fatal in such waters, and caution naturally evolved into tradition over time. Yet practical danger alone did not fully explain the emotional atmosphere attached to Eilean Mòr in local memory. The island's remoteness, silence, and visible separation from ordinary human life allowed older beliefs and stories to survive there with unusual persistence. Separate from the later lighthouse mystery, several of the island's unsettling associations already existed quietly within oral tradition across the Hebrides. Islanders and sailors familiar with regional folklore often inherited stories not through written history, but through repeated conversation shaped across generations. Many of these traditions blurred the boundary between religious symbolism, cautionary storytelling, and supernatural suggestion without drawing firm distinctions between them. Remote islands occupied a particularly important place within these narratives because they represented spaces where ordinary social order weakened against the overwhelming presence of sea, weather and isolation. Eilean Mòr's later reputation therefore did not emerge from nothing after 1900. Instead, the disappearance of the keepers amplified beliefs and anxieties that had already lingered around the island in quieter forms for many years. After reports describing the disappearance of the 3 keepers reached the mainland, older beliefs surrounding the island began spreading far beyond local communities. Newspapers covering the case quickly recognised the dramatic potential created by combining an abandoned lighthouse with long-standing Hebridean folklore, and public fascination intensified as stories moved farther from the islands themselves. Journalists, writers, and later storytellers increasingly incorporated regional traditions into retellings of the mystery, often blending verified facts with speculation in ways that proved difficult to separate afterward. The image of an isolated Atlantic island already associated with strange customs and inherited caution fit naturally into public imagination, particularly during a period when maritime disasters still occupied a powerful place within British culture. As the official explanation surrounding the disappearance weakened under scrutiny, folklore surrounding Eilean Mòr grew steadily more influential. Newspaper accounts and later retellings steadily merged documented events with folklore until the boundary between historical record and legend became increasingly uncertain. Reports describing fearful journal entries, unusual silence within the station, and strange emotional reactions among investigators blended easily with older island traditions once the case entered popular culture. Over time, dramatic embellishments accumulated around the disappearance, including stories that cannot be verified through surviving official evidence, yet continue appearing in discussions of the mystery today. Historians examining the Flannan Isles case have frequently noted how powerfully folklore shaped public memory of the event, sometimes obscuring distinctions between documented facts and later invention. Yet even when exaggerations are removed, the underlying atmosphere surrounding the island remained unusually difficult to dismiss because so much of the case depended upon absence, silence, and unresolved uncertainty rather than direct evidence. Even historians skeptical of supernatural interpretations have noted how strongly regional traditions influence public perception of the case afterward. The official explanation proposed by Lighthouse authorities remained grounded in entirely plausible maritime dangers, yet many people continued gravitating toward more unsettling possibilities, because the emotional atmosphere surrounding Eilean Mòr seemed resistant to ordinary closure. Local folklore helped reinforce that impression by framing the island not merely as a location where an accident occurred, but as a place already culturally associated with unease and inherited caution long before the lighthouse existed there. In this way, folklore did not replace the historical investigation surrounding the disappearance. Instead, it gradually intertwined with the evidence itself until the two became difficult to separate within popular memory. For generations following the disappearance, Eilean Mòr remained fixed in cultural memory as something far stranger than a conventional maritime tragedy. Writers, researchers, dramatists, and paranormal theorists repeatedly returned to the island because its combination of physical isolation, incomplete evidence, psychological unease, and older folklore created a mystery uniquely suited to reinterpretation. The lighthouse stood not simply as a site connected to probable loss at sea, but as a symbol of unanswered absence preserved against one of the most isolated landscapes in Britain. Every retelling seemed to add another layer to the atmosphere already surrounding the island, ensuring that the Flannan Isles mystery would continue evolving long after the original investigation had ended. Soon, explanations surrounding the vanished keepers would expand into theories that resisted disappearance almost as stubbornly as the mystery itself. Theories that refused to disappear. With no definitive evidence ever recovered from the waters surrounding Eilean Mòr, competing explanations began multiplying almost immediately after the investigation ended. The disappearance of the 3 keepers created an unusual kind of mystery because the case offered just enough physical evidence to encourage reconstruction, while withholding the one thing investigators needed most: certainty. No witnesses observed the men's final movements near the cliffs. No bodies returned from the Atlantic to confirm the official theory. The lighthouse itself preserved fragments of interrupted routine without revealing precisely how that interruption occurred. Under those conditions, the mystery naturally expanded beyond the conclusions proposed by the Northern Lighthouse Board, allowing alternative explanations to survive decade after decade, even when evidence supporting them remained incomplete or uncertain. Some researchers eventually argued that the Atlantic itself still offered the most convincing answer, through the possibility of rogue waves striking the western landing unexpectedly. Unlike ordinary storm waves, rogue seas can emerge suddenly and with extraordinary force, particularly around isolated coastlines where underwater geography and violent weather patterns combine unpredictably. The western landing on Eilean Mòr faced directly into open Atlantic water, leaving it highly exposed during rough winter conditions. Investigators examining the island shortly after the disappearance discovered damage consistent with powerful wave impacts, including displaced equipment and signs that enormous seas had reached areas positioned well above normal water levels. For many historians, these physical realities continue supporting the possibility that the keepers were lost during a sudden maritime accident, rather than through anything more mysterious. Modern understanding of extreme ocean behaviour later strengthened aspects of the wave theory by demonstrating how isolated seas can produce sudden walls of water capable of overwhelming experienced men. During the 20th century, scientific research gradually confirmed that rogue waves were not merely maritime folklore, but genuine oceanic phenomena capable of appearing with devastating unpredictability. This development caused some researchers to revisit the Flannan Isles disappearance with renewed attention toward the Atlantic environment itself. The isolated geography surrounding Eilean Mòr, combined with steep cliffs and violent winter seas, created conditions where even highly experienced lighthouse keepers could have been caught fatally off guard. Yet while rogue wave theory explains the disappearance in practical terms, it still leaves certain procedural and emotional details unresolved, including why all three men appear to have left the station simultaneously, and why the atmosphere surrounding the final reported journal entries seemed so deeply unsettled. Other interpretations moved away from environmental disaster entirely, and focused instead on the psychological strain created by prolonged isolation inside remote lighthouse stations. Historians studying lighthouse life have frequently noted the intense emotional pressures associated with isolated postings, particularly during winter months when storms prevented relief ships from arriving and communication with the mainland remained impossible. Keepers stationed on remote islands lived within highly repetitive routines, shaped by silence, confinement, and relentless Atlantic weather. Some later writers suggested that these conditions may have contributed to emotional instability, panic, or irrational decision-making during the final days on Eilean Mòr. While no surviving evidence confirms psychological collapse among the three men, the unsettling tone associated with some reported journal entries encouraged speculation that the atmosphere inside the station may have deteriorated before the disappearance occurred. Speculation involving interpersonal conflict emerged partly because the disappearance left behind no witnesses capable of explaining the final movements of the three keepers. Certain later theories proposed that an argument or confrontation may have escalated unexpectedly near the cliffs before all three men were lost to the sea. Supporters of such ideas pointed toward the absence of direct evidence, confirming exactly why the keepers left the station together, particularly during dangerous conditions. Yet historians generally treat these theories cautiously because no physical signs of violence were discovered inside the lighthouse, and surviving records offer no verified indication of hostility between the men. James Ducat and Thomas Marshall were experienced lighthouse keepers with established service histories, while Donald MacArthur had maritime experience shaped by difficult working environments across Scotland's western coast. Without stronger evidence, theories centred on violent conflict remain largely speculative, despite their continued appearance in popular retellings of the case. Rumours connected to smuggling operations and covert maritime activity appeared gradually over later decades, as writers searched for explanations outside the official investigation. The remoteness of the Flannan Isles encouraged imaginative theories, involving secret encounters between the keepers and unknown visitors arriving from the sea under cover of darkness. Some speculative accounts suggested the men may have witnessed illegal maritime activity or become involved in an encounter they were never meant to survive. Stories of hidden boats approaching isolated coastlines have long occupied maritime folklore throughout Britain, particularly in regions historically associated with smuggling routes and difficult coastal surveillance. yet no verified evidence links the Flannan Isles disappearance to criminal activity of any kind. Investigators found no signs of intrusion inside the station, no reports of suspicious vessels nearby, and no surviving testimony capable of supporting such narratives beyond speculation alone. Cold War era fascination with espionage and hidden naval activity eventually pulled the Flannan Isles mystery into increasingly elaborate territory, unsupported by direct historical evidence. During the mid-20th century, public fascination with secret operations, intelligence agencies, and unexplained military activity shaped reinterpretations of many older mysteries, including Eilean Mòr. Some later writers proposed theories involving covert naval missions, foreign agents, or classified maritime operations supposedly connected to the disappearance. These claims reflected broader cultural anxieties more than historical reality, and researchers examining the case have found no credible evidence linking the Lighthouse mystery to espionage activity. Nevertheless, the persistence of such theories demonstrated how strongly the absence of definitive answers encouraged each generation to reinterpret the case according to its own fears and cultural obsessions. Supernatural interpretations proved even more difficult to erase once folklore surrounding Eilean Mòr became permanently attached to public memory of the disappearance. Stories involving curses, spirits, mysterious forces, or unexplained presences on the island expanded steadily after the case entered popular culture, particularly because the disappearance already possessed many elements associated with classic maritime legends: isolation, silence, abandoned quarters, and men vanishing without trace. Local traditions connected to the Flannan Isles added emotional depth to these interpretations, allowing supernatural explanations to appear intertwined with older beliefs surrounding the island itself. Historians remain careful to distinguish documented facts from later embellishment, yet the emotional atmosphere surrounding the case ensured that paranormal interpretations continued surviving, regardless of official conclusions. The lighthouse became not merely the site of an unresolved accident, but a symbolic setting onto which generations projected fear, uncertainty, and fascination. Rather than resolving the mystery completely, each theory seemed to illuminate one part of the evidence while leaving other details suspended in uncertainty. Rogue waves explained the damaged equipment near the western landing, but not every procedural irregularity inside the station. Psychological theories addressed the strange emotional atmosphere connected to the reported journal entries but lacked direct proof. Folklore and supernatural interpretations captured the haunting, emotional quality surrounding the disappearance, while offering no verifiable mechanism for what occurred. Even the official explanation proposed by Lighthouse authorities remained plausible without ever achieving complete certainty. The mystery endured precisely because no single interpretation could account fully for every surviving detail at the same time. Debates surrounding the fate of the keepers endured across generations because the case occupied a rare position between plausible tragedy and unresolved psychological unease. Many maritime disappearances involve circumstances so straightforward that public fascination fades once practical explanations emerge. The Flannan Isles case resisted that process because the evidence remained emotionally incomplete even when logical explanations appeared available. The silence inside the station, the disputed journal entries, the damaged western landing, and the absence of witnesses combined into a narrative that continually invited reinterpretation without ever surrendering fully to any one conclusion. Every attempt to stabilize the mystery eventually encountered another unanswered question waiting beneath the surface. Few maritime disappearances from the early 20th century continued attracting such persistent reinterpretation, precisely because the silence surrounding Eilean Mòr never fully surrendered to explanation. Historians, journalists, paranormal writers, and maritime researchers all approached the case from different directions, yet each ultimately confronted the same absence at the center of the story. The Atlantic preserved no final testimony from the three keepers. The lighthouse itself retained only fragments of interrupted routine. More than a century later, the mystery remained alive not because the evidence clearly supported extraordinary explanations, but because certainty itself had vanished alongside the men. Even after the investigations, theories, and folklore spread far beyond the Hebrides, the lighthouse itself remained inseparable from the mystery left behind within its walls, the lighthouse that never escaped the mystery. Far outside the boundaries of the original investigation, The disappearance on Eilean Mòr slowly transformed into one of the most enduring mysteries in British maritime history. In the years immediately following December 1900, the case already carried many of the elements that allowed unresolved tragedies to survive within public imagination. An isolated location, missing men, incomplete evidence, and an atmosphere of silence that seemed almost impossible to explain completely. Yet what distinguished the Flannan Isles mystery from countless other maritime disappearances was the unusual emotional power attached to the abandoned lighthouse itself. The station did not merely become associated with tragedy, it became associated with interruption, with ordinary human routines suddenly stopping against one of the loneliest landscapes in Britain. That image remained difficult to forget long after official investigators left the island behind. Unlike countless other accidents recorded along the Scottish coast, the Flannan Isles case refused to fade quietly from public attention after the early inquiries concluded. Maritime disasters were tragically common throughout the late 19th and early 20th centuries, particularly around the dangerous Atlantic waters west of Scotland, where storms, reefs, and violent seas routinely claimed ships and lives without warning. Most incidents eventually settled into historical records once practical explanations emerged. Eilean Mòr followed a different path because the disappearance resisted emotional closure, even when authorities proposed a logical conclusion. The wave accident theory remained plausible, yet uncertainty lingered around the journal entries, the missing men, the abandoned station, and the strange silence Joseph Moore encountered upon arrival. Rather than resolving the mystery, time seemed only to deepen its atmosphere. Among the earliest works to preserve the mystery and cultural memory was Wilfrid Wilson Gibson's poem Flannan Isle, published in 1912. The poem introduced the disappearance to readers far removed from Scotland's western coast and helped shape the emotional language through which many later audiences understood the mystery. Gibson emphasised the abandoned atmosphere inside the lighthouse rather than procedural investigation, focusing on silence, absence, and the unsettling feeling of entering a place where ordinary life had vanished unexpectedly. Although poetic interpretations naturally dramatise certain aspects of the story, the work captured something central to the enduring fascination surrounding Eilean Mòr. The mystery did not survive merely because 3 men disappeared. It survived because the disappearance appeared to leave behind an emotional vacuum inside the lighthouse itself, as though the station continued waiting for men who would never return. Maritime historians returning to the disappearance throughout the 20th century often found themselves confronting the same unresolved gaps left behind by the original investigation. Researchers carefully examined surviving correspondence from the Northern Lighthouse Board, weather observations, testimony connected to the Hesperus, and the practical realities of lighthouse procedure in remote Atlantic stations. Many concluded that the official explanation involving violent seas near the western landing remained the most probable outcome. The geography surrounding Eilean Mòr supported that conclusion strongly. Atlantic storms routinely battered the island with extraordinary force, and damaged equipment discovered near the cliffs clearly indicated recent heavy seas. Yet, historical analysis rarely eliminated the deeper unease surrounding the case, because the disappearance ultimately depended upon reconstruction rather than proof. No final witness survived to describe what happened beside the cliffs below the lighthouse. Documentary filmmakers and television producers later recognized that the visual isolation of the lighthouse carried an atmosphere few historical mysteries could equal. Throughout the later 20th century and into the modern era, the Flannan Isles became a recurring subject within programs exploring maritime disasters, unsolved disappearances, and unexplained historical events. Sweeping aerial footage of the Hebrides, storm waves striking the western cliffs, abandoned stone pathways, and the lonely silhouette of the lighthouse itself reinforced the emotional power already embedded within the story. Yet the strongest documentaries often avoided sensationalism entirely because the case did not require exaggeration to remain compelling. The documented facts alone created an atmosphere difficult to dismiss. A relief vessel arriving at a silent station, a clock stopped within empty quarters, and 3 experienced keepers erased without direct trace from one of the most isolated islands in Britain. Paranormal writers gradually expanded the story even further by combining folklore, disputed journal entries, and emotional speculation surrounding the island. As the case moved deeper into popular culture, Eilean Mòr increasingly became associated with broader traditions of supernatural maritime mystery. Books discussing haunted locations, unexplained disappearances, or strange events along remote coastlines frequently incorporated the Flannan Isles, alongside legends involving ghost ships, phantom lights, and cursed islands. Some writers emphasised older Hebridean traditions connected to St Flannan and the island chapel ruins, while others focused on dramatic interpretations of the keeper's final reported behaviour. Over time, embellishments accumulated steadily around the case, including details unsupported by surviving records, but repeated frequently enough to become embedded within public imagination. Historians attempting to separate fact from invention often discovered how thoroughly folklore and documentation had become intertwined around the disappearance. Academic studies examining lighthouse service in remote regions also helped keep attention fixed upon the harsh psychological realities connected to stations like Eilean Mòr. Historians researching maritime labour increasingly emphasised the extraordinary isolation faced by lighthouse keepers before automation transformed coastal navigation systems during the 20th century. Men assigned to remote stations lived according to repetitive schedules shaped by weather, silence, mechanical maintenance, and prolonged separation from ordinary mainland life. Relief vessels sometimes failed to arrive for extended periods during winter storms, leaving keepers trapped within isolated environments where the Atlantic itself seemed to dominate daily existence completely. Through this perspective, the Flannan Isles case became not only an unsolved mystery, but also a reflection of the emotional and environmental pressures surrounding lighthouse service during one of the harshest periods of maritime history. Tourism, regional storytelling, and continued fascination with unsolved disappearances ensured that the Flannan Isles mystery survived well beyond the era of manned lighthouses. Although Eilean Mòr itself remained difficult to access, the story surrounding the island became deeply connected to the broader cultural identity of Scotland's western coast. Museums, maritime exhibitions, books about the Hebrides, and collections of Scottish folklore repeatedly returned to the disappearance because it occupied a rare position between documented historical event and enduring legend. Travellers visiting the Outer Hebrides frequently encountered references to the mystery through discussions of lighthouse history or local storytelling traditions, allowing the case to persist not only through mass media, but through regional cultural memory as well. What preserved the case across generations was not proof of the supernatural or discovery of new evidence, but the stubborn incompleteness surrounding every explanation ever proposed. Rogue wave theories explained the damaged western landing yet left procedural questions unresolved. Psychological interpretations addressed emotional tension while lacking direct evidence. Folklore captured the atmosphere surrounding the island without offering verifiable answers. Even the official explanation proposed by lighthouse authorities remained reasonable without ever becoming fully satisfying. The mystery endured because each theory illuminated part of the evidence, while another portion remained hidden beyond certainty. Through decades of retelling, the missing keepers slowly became suspended between documented history and something far more mythic within public imagination. James Ducat, Thomas Marshall, and Donald MacArthur began as ordinary men carrying out routine duties within the Northern Lighthouse Board system, yet their disappearance transformed them permanently into figures connected to one of Britain's most enduring unresolved mysteries. The lighthouse itself eventually ceased operation in 1971, when automation eliminated the need for permanent keepers on remote stations like Eilean Mòr. But the silence surrounding the disappearance survived the end of the human presence that first gave rise to it. More than a century later, the silence left behind on Eilean Mòr still drifts through the Atlantic unresolved, carrying with it the final unanswered moments of the three vanished keepers.